Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. This is going to be a discussion around Book 2 of Richard Wright's Native Son, Flight. I'm going to have to give some spoilers from Book 1, Fear. If you haven't read that, at least read the first third of Native Son before watching this. Or you don't care, that's fine too. You can always just look on Wikipedia. But this is an important part of the novel. I think the middle of the novel is the most important part. It's the part that infuriated a lot of people when it was published, has infuriated people since then, infuriates people now. It is the part of the book that it resonates the most because of the violence within it. There is there is a sexual assault or rape that is narrated. It is unquestionable what happens. There's no ambiguity. It's somewhat graphic, but the fact that it occurs is like horribly, viscerally unpleasant. There's a murder that occurs that is equally as viscerally unpleasant. So this is the part of the book that made people, I think, wonder, what the heck is Richard Wright doing? Why is he writing a book in which he has a young black man who now begins to be given over to violence and to sexual violence? The whole point, to some, the whole point of writing around, I don't want to say like identity writing or like social justice writing, but writing these books as like an educated African American was to show progress, to show intelligence, to show all of these things. And Wright has explicitly stated in an essay that he wrote Native Son in a sense to get under people's skins, to say, stop giving false sympathy or false empathy and passive empathy towards what's going on, towards racial injustice and economic injustice, and recognize this is real, this is terrifying, this is really, really bad. And so that's what we see in this. We begin with, it's really fascinating. So Bigger has accidentally smothered a person in book 1. I'll try not to spoil any more than that. He's accidentally smothered somebody, and he ends up now beginning to experience this bizarre, almost Nietzschean Superman type concept. So now that the ice was broken, could he not do other things? What was there to stop him? While sitting there at the table waiting for his breakfast, he felt that he was arriving at something which had long eluded him. Things were becoming clear. He would know how to act from now on. The thing to do was to act just like others acted, live like they lived, and while they were not looking, do what you wanted. They would never know. He felt in the quiet presence of his mother, brother, and sister a force, inarticulate and unconscious, making for living without thinking, making for peace and habit, making for a hope that blinded. Now who on earth would think that he, a black, timid Negro boy, would murder, And so he begins to have this experience of like, he suddenly is no longer blind. And as a reader, this is my reread, but as I was reading it, I was thinking like, gosh, like the way Wright's writing, he makes it sound like some of that conversation around the famous Leopold and Loeb murder case, which had occurred about 16 years earlier in Chicago. And then of course Wright flat out says like, yes, this is what I'm referencing. He's taken the mentality of two young men who were like college graduates as teenagers and were regarded as like, boy geniuses, who crafted a plan to do a perfect crime, kidnap a boy and murder him, and then were caught and famously sentenced to life in prison, not death, in Illinois, in Chicago. And so Bessie, Bigger's girlfriend, has worked as like a maid in a house on the same street as either Leopold or Loeb. And so as she's like reading that, she's thinking around like this idea. And so it's fascinating to have Wright, 15 years after this occurred, creating a character, an uneducated African-American adolescent who's about the same age as Leopold and Loeb, lives in the same city, but is from like total opposite end of the spectrum, and he's having that character think in a way that they did. Now the difference is Leopold and Loeb crafted that murder. They planned to go ahead and kill this boy. Bigger didn't intend to kill anyone. And Wright curiously puts in this idea of, well, he had killed before, he had just never like gone through with it. He had hated, he had been so angry before, and felt so foisted upon that he wanted to kill but had never actually done it. And this was the first time it happened, and it was an accident, honestly. It's an interesting parallel. It's an interesting stylistic parallel. Another one that becomes really important within this book is to me, it's the short story by Edgar Allan Poe, The Black Cat, where a murder has been committed, and the cat keeps, the black cat is like the signifier, but the black cat's purring is sort of this signal. Well, Wright does an interesting thing where he has, as Bigger's, back at the house of his employer, and they're looking for the missing daughter, and a kidnapping note is later found that Bigger has written. They have a white cat, and so instead of a white male character with a black cat that is sort of like the signifying factor of an outing the crime there, we have Bigger, who's a black man, with a white cat that will like jump on him. He gets photographed by the press with that happening. So I think that was an interesting inversion. I'm not positive that Wright was doing that, but as a reader in my mind, it felt like that's what was going on. Some other ideas that felt really important. Bigger, in a sense, acts in a manner that's analogous to the like overreaching protagonist that Christopher Marlowe writes in his plays, where they're always, or even John Webster to a certain degree, some of his like anti-heroes and his tragedies, where they achieve a certain level of like getting away with something, and then they want to take it a step further, and they take it a step further, and they take it a step further, and ultimately that proves the undoing. And so for Bigger, there's been an accident, but now like his mind is clear. Maybe he can think through these things. Maybe he can pretend and put up this facade, but in his mind he's thinking through things. So an accident has occurred, there's a death. What if the body's missing? Maybe we could put out a kidnapping note. That'll throw him off, and maybe I can divert attention this way. And he begins to, in the aftermath of an accident, act more and more like a criminal. And we see that he goes from being someone who was not necessarily a happy character in book one. Like, he seemed afraid of things. He seemed really like tense. The tension is unbearable throughout this book. But he now goes to a character who's not only angry, but he wonders how much farther he can go. Like, he continually thinks, should I just leave town? Should I just go, cut my losses and run? Not with anybody. Don't talk to anybody. Just go. And he keeps thinking, no, I'm gonna wait. No, I'm gonna wait. No, I'm gonna wait. And of course, that leads to a denouement within the basement of his employer's house, where you have the smoke from the furnace, or the furnace is blocked up with ash, and so the smoke, the draft, it can't get any air in, and so it's cold. Well, Bigger then goes and does not clear the ash out very well, and now smoke comes billowing through, and it creates this sense that basement for a moment is basically hell. And then when the smoke clears and the fog clears, Bigger thinks he was blinded, and that the accident, the accidental smothering like cleared his eyes. But now, of course, it clears up what has happened, and that there's been a body in that furnace, and so that new revelation, that new clearing of the smoke, of course, causes Bigger to run, and that enters into the sequence of the book that I really think is the part that bothers, to a very deep level, readers from the past 80 years now of this book, and that is where Bigger, takes his girlfriend, and they go kind of on the run into just a low tenement on the south side of Chicago that should be condemned. He assaults her that night, he rapes her, and he murders her. And we're then treated to a sequence that is really quite harrowing, where he is, and it's only about 20 pages, where he is up on the rooftop of a building during like snow has blanketed the city, and he's being chased by some white men. And so we have a page, like I had said, this is kind of the part that narrates. So to kind of give Bigger's attitude during this, he had murdered and created a new life for himself. It was something that was all his own, and it was the first time in his life he had had anything that others could not take from him. Yes, he could sit here calmly and eat and not be concerned about what his family thought or did. He had a natural wall from behind which he could look at them. His crime was an anchor weighing him safely in time. It added to him a certain confidence which his gun and knife did not. He was outside now, over and beyond them. They were incapable of even thinking that he had done such a deed, and he had done something which even he had not thought possible. And so then later on, he had to save himself, but it was familiar, this running away. All his life he had been knowing that sooner or later something like this would come to him, and now here it was. He had always felt outside of this white world, and now it was true. It made things simple. He felt in his shirt, yes, the gun was still there. He might have to use it. And so Bigger becomes aware from newspaper accounts that there basically a massive manhunt is on for him that has netted approximately 100 African American men who are innocent, have been beaten, arrested. He had tried to cover the accidental death by saying it might have been the boyfriend who's a communist. And that will become more important in book 3. Spoilers. But this is where it gets really scary. This is a newspaper article from it. Reports were current that several Negro men were beaten in various North and West Side neighborhoods. In the Hyde Park and Englewood districts, men organized vigilante groups and sent word to Chief of Police Glenman, offering aid. Glenman said this morning that the aid of such groups would be accepted. He stated that a woefully undermanned police force, together with recurring waves of Negro crime, made such a procedure necessary. Several hundred Negroes resembling Bigger Thomas were rounded up from Southside hotspots. They are being held for investigation. In a radio broadcast last night, Mayor Ditz warned of possible mob violence and exhorted the public to maintain order. Every effort is being made to apprehend this fiend. It is reported that several hundred Negro employees throughout the city had been dismissed from jobs. A well-known banker's wife phoned this paper that she had dismissed her Negro cook for fear that she might poison the children. And so Bigger begins to realize that now that he has been blamed for not only the murder of a white woman, but there's no evidence of it. They just assume that he must have also assaulted her, sexually assaulted her. And so they're looking for this, young black man who's been accused of raping a white woman. And massive violence has occurred. We have this harrowing sequence where he's trying to hide along the rooftops, and they kind of trap him on a water tower. They fire some shots. He fires some shots. And then they use a water hose to try and spray him down during the aftermath of a snowstorm. So it's freezing. Now, what's very curious is right before that happens, Richard Wright throws a line in there where Bigger can hear the white men who are looking for him. And one of them makes some comments about how attractive one of the black women is, and is like, why would this guy come looking for a white woman when they've got her, her, and there's another one's like, yeah, if I had her, I wouldn't be leaving and stuff. And so it's okay for them to make these comments about an African American woman, but if Bigger were to make those comments without committing any crime, accidental or otherwise, if Bigger were to make those comments, we as a reader can imagine what would happen. And it's shown as that's something they can do. And nobody says anything, but with an African American, that would be completely unallowed. It would be considered tantamount to a crime. And so, book 2 again is really the hardest part to read, but I think Wright's very intentional around what he's doing in this part. He's really trying to show the horrifying mentality that exists, but also explore how quickly racial injustice, how it becomes like a wildfire there in Chicago. And he does both really well. Bigger, you know, we begin the book, and Bigger is not necessarily the most like pleasant protagonist, but he also doesn't, you know, he does some stuff that's unpleasant. But we don't see him doing really awful things beyond like threatening some friends, really. And then in book two, it just drops. And Leopold and Loeb are going to kind of come back as a theme for book three, but I think that's a really fascinating juxtaposition Wright had done. I didn't pay as much attention to that the first time I read it. So those are just some thoughts around it. It's again, it's an excellent book. It's well worth reading. If you're kind of thinking it, like I'd said, the plays of Christopher Marlowe, weirdly, like the protagonist aligned to Bigger, I think. Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat. The Chester Himes novel, The Real Cool Killers, deals with an actual like gang of youths who basically create a massive manhunt in Harlem in the 1950s, I believe. And by Chester Himes, who was a close friend of Richard Wright's. So, and deeply influenced by him. So those are some works to kind of consider with this. But I'll be continuing to work through Native Son. Allan's reading it as well. And book three kind of takes an interesting, a different turn, a different tone. So we've had unbearable tension through now, and that's where I'll end. Thank you.